The grand hall of the stellar court shimmered with silver banners and crystal walls that reflected the soft glow of 100 alien worlds brought together under one roof. The alien queen sat on her throne high above the assembly, her crown alive, with faint lights that pulsed in rhythm with her breathing. Her eyes were a deep shade of gold, and her presence carried a weight that silenced even the most talkative diplomats. It was a day of great importance as envoys from all corners of the galaxy had gathered to discuss a fragile alliance, and among the guards standing at the edges of the hall was a human named Daniel. His armor was simple compared to the ornate plates of the alien soldiers, yet his posture was firm and his gaze sharp. He had been chosen for his calm under pressure and his ability to notice what others missed. The queen began her address, her voice carrying through the hall without the need for amplification. Every word seemed carved from authority, yet woven with a grace that drew the attention of every ear. She spoke of unity and of the need to share resources between worlds. She spoke of dangers beyond the known stars that threatened them. All Daniel kept his eyes moving across the crowd, scanning for anything unusual. The queen was halfway through her speech when the first flicker of something wrong passed over her expression. It was subtle, just a slight hesitation, but Daniel caught it. Her voice wavered for the briefest moment before resuming, then it happened again, a pause, a faint twitch of her jaw. Her hand moved slightly to her chest as if adjusting the folds of her robe. Daniel could see tension in her fingers. The hall was silent as she continued speaking, yet the words were now slower, almost strained. The golden light in her eyes dimmed just enough to make Daniel frown. A ripple of unease moved through the assembly, and then without warning the queen's body stiffened. Her crown flickered, her head tilted back, and she let out a sharp gasp. Her hands clutched at her chest, and she collapsed forward, sliding from the throne's seat before the alien attendants could react. A wave of shock swept through the hall as voices rose in panic. The guards rushed forward, the alien medics already moving with floating drones that scanned her body. Daniel stepped forward with them, though the alien soldiers around him were tense as if ready to block his way. He kept his distance, but his eyes were sharp, searching for any clue. And then he saw it. As the queen's body was lifted, a small object slid from the folds of her robe. It was no larger than a coin, glinting faintly before hitting the smooth floor. Daniel's eyes locked onto it, and for a heartbeat he thought about reaching down to pick it up. But in that moment, a tall alien guard stepped between him and the object, his long staff pushing Daniel back. The guard's voice was low and sharp, ordering him to stand aside while the medics carried the queen away. The medics moved with efficiency, carrying her through a side passage that sealed behind them. The crystal walls of the hall reflected the shifting light of the banners as murmurs grew louder. Some aliens speculated it was an assassination attempt. Others whispered about rare diseases. Daniel kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. He had served as a guard long enough to know the look of genuine confusion on medics' faces, and he had seen it just now. None of them seemed to know what had caused her collapse, and yet the object on the floor had been taken without a word. High Steward of the court, a tall alien with smooth silver skin and a voice like ringing glass, stepped forward to address the assembly. He assured everyone the queen was in stable condition and that the gathering would continue once she had rested. But Daniel noted the slight tremor in his voice and the way his eyes avoided meeting anyone's directly. The human guard returned to his station, but his thoughts stayed locked on what he had seen. He replayed the moment in his mind, the small object, the flicker of light, the quick movement of the alien guard. Who had taken it? There had been no reason to hide such an item unless it carried a truth. They did not want exposed. The rest of the summit session passed in uneasy quiet. The alien dignitaries spoke in shorter turns, their eyes shifting toward the queen's empty throne. Daniel felt the weight of the room pressing down like an invisible hand. His training told him to keep to his duties to avoid drawing attention, but a deeper instinct told him this was no random medical incident. The timing was too precise, the collapse too sudden. The queen had been strong just moments before, and yet something had struck at her without warning. As the final speaker finished, the High Steward dismissed the assembly. Daniel walked slowly toward the exit, his eyes scanning the polished floor for any sign of the object. But it was gone completely. The alien guard who had taken it was nowhere to be seen. Daniel knew the palace well enough to guess the object had been taken to a secure location, but he also knew that whatever it was, it might hold the answer to what had just happened. He kept his pace steady as he left the hall, but inside his mind was already moving toward a decision. He would not let this go unanswered. In the outer corridors, the palace walls were alive with soft colors from the twin suns outside, and the sounds of distant activity filled the air. Daniel paused near one of the tall windows, looking out at the sprawling city beyond. The alien architecture was a blend of graceful curves and towering spires connected by floating walkways. From here the empire seemed unshakable. Yet inside the palace, its heart had just faltered, and no one knew why. He thought again of the object, the faint glint, and the way the guard had moved so quickly to hide it. Something about that action gnawed at him. It was not the movement of a man protecting the queen. It was the movement of someone protecting a secret. Daniel tightened his grip on the strap of his armor and turned away from the view. He had a feeling that by the time the day was over, he would be walking paths in the palace that guards were never meant to tread. The palace corridors were heavy with silence as Daniel made his way toward the guard barracks. Every step seemed to echo against the polished stone, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The queen's sudden collapse was the only thing anyone could think about, yet the alien guards kept their expressions blank, their voices low and clipped. It was as if an unspoken order had passed through the ranks, telling everyone to say nothing. Daniel knew enough about military discipline to recognize when silence was enforced rather than chosen, and this was exactly that kind of silence. When Daniel reached the barracks, a group of alien guards stood in a loose circle, speaking in their native tongue. Their words were low and sharp, and their eyes shifted toward him only for a moment before turning away. He could not understand their language completely, but he picked up fragments from their expressions and gestures. The collapse had not been expected by anyone, not even the palace medics, and yet the tone of the guard suggested they feared something far greater than a simple illness. The phrase they repeated sounded like forbidden truth, and each time it was spoken one of them glanced toward the sealed wing of the palace where the queen was being kept under heavy guard. Daniel sat at his bunk, pretending to adjust his armor straps while keeping his ears open. Every fragment of conversation painted the same picture. They did not trust the human presence in the palace, and they were speaking as if humans themselves might be tied to whatever had happened. He could feel the tension building around him like invisible wires pulling tighter with each passing hour. It was not the first time he had served among aliens who distrusted humans, but there was something more here, something sharper. By midday, the High Steward summoned all guards to the main training hall. He stood before them, his silver skin reflecting the light from the high windows. His voice was cold as he announced that from this moment forward, the Queen's condition was a matter of royal security, and no discussion about it was permitted among the staff. Any breach would be treated as an act of treason. The guards nodded in unison, though Daniel noticed how none of them looked surprised at the severity of the order. It was clear the cover-up had already begun, and the order was just the final lock on the door. When the assembly was dismissed, Daniel lingered at the edge of the hall, watching as the alien guards grouped together once again. They were careful not to speak near him now. Instead, their conversations dissolved into low whispers. When he approached, the human guard knew this meant he was already under suspicion, and that made his task even harder, but it also gave him a strange sense of determination. If they believed he was involved, they might slip up trying to watch him, and that could give him an opening later that evening. Daniel made his way through the less patrolled corridors of the palace. These were service routes used mostly by maintenance, drones and low-ranking attendants. The air here smelled faintly of oil and sterilizing chemicals, and the light was dimmer, casting long shadows on the floor. He moved quietly, remembering the exact spot where the Queen had been carried away after her collapse. It was near the entrance to the Royal Medical Wing, a part of the palace usually off-limits to everyone. But the highest-ranking staff, he walked past slowly, keeping his head down but his eyes sharp. The guards posted at the entrance were the same two who had blocked his path earlier. One of them was the very guard who had picked up the strange object, and his hand now rested on his weapon in a way that made it clear Daniel would not be welcome here. Daniel continued on, but he felt the weight of their eyes on his back. When he was far enough away, he took a narrow stairwell that led to the archives. The archives were vast and filled with rows of crystal shelves, each holding glowing data tablets from across the empire. Few guards came here unless assigned, and Daniel had memorized enough of the layout to move. Without drawing attention, he searched the public medical records for any sign of heart conditions in the Queen's species but found nothing. Their physiology made such failures almost impossible, at least according to centuries of recorded knowledge. There were no patterns, no previous cases, nothing to suggest that what happened could be explained as natural. He found himself staring at a series of reports marked for restricted access. The system denied him entry, but he recognized the date stamps. They were recent and all connected to visits from human diplomats, including one from the previous week. The coincidence was too much to ignore, but the system security would not let him through. Without access, he could not confirm his suspicion. Yet the possibility had taken root in his mind. Something about human interaction had changed the Queen and perhaps pushed her beyond what her body could handle. As Daniel left the archives, he heard footsteps echoing from the far end of the hall. A palace attendant approached carrying a sealed container of medical supplies. The attendant did not notice him at first, but when their eyes met, the alien froze for a second, then quickly continued walking. Daniel saw the insignia on the container. It belonged to the Royal Medical Wing. That was unusual because attendants normally traveled with a guard escort when transporting anything. From that wing, Daniel decided not to stop the alien, but instead to follow at a distance, keeping to the shadows and using the curve of the corridor for cover. Attendant moved quickly, taking another set of service corridors, and finally disappearing through a small side door. Daniel knew this door led into the same restricted wing where the Queen was being treated. He stayed hidden behind a column, watching the door until it shut completely. Something was happening inside that wing, and the guards were ensuring no one outside their circle saw it. By the time Daniel returned to his quarters, the palace lights had dimmed to the evening setting. He sat on the edge of his bunk thinking about the object, the sealed medical reports, the unguarded attendant, and the hushed warnings of forbidden truth. Every thread pointed toward something deeply dangerous, and he could feel the shape of it forming in his mind, though he still lacked the final piece. He knew he could not risk waiting for permission or orders. The truth was being buried, and if he did nothing, it might stay buried forever. He had served in dangerous places before, but never had the stakes felt this strange and personal. The Queen's life hung in the balance, and so too did the fragile trust between humans and her people, and he was caught in the center with nothing but questions and a growing need to find answers before it was too late. Night in the palace was different from day, not only in the dim light that washed over the high crystal ceilings, but in the way the air itself seemed to hold secrets. During the day, the halls rang with the sound of voices and footsteps and the hum of diplomatic business, but in the night there was only the faint hum of the environmental systems and the soft glide of maintenance, drones moving like silent ghosts. Daniel moved through the shadowed corridors with the easy caution of a man used to avoiding notice. His armor was left behind in his quarters, replaced by a simple guard tunic that would draw less attention. The plan was not to be seen, and if he was seen, to look like he belonged exactly where he was. The path he took was one. Few guards used a narrow stairwell, hidden behind a supply alcove that led to an older section of the archives. The older sections were rarely visited except by record keepers, and most of those keepers were mechanical constructs that ignored anyone without specific clearance. Daniel knew from experience that these areas sometimes held copies of restricted files, duplicates that had not been wiped during security updates. The air here smelled faintly of old data crystals, and the faint hum of the shelves was almost like the breathing of a living thing. Moved down the rows, scanning for the same date markers he had seen in the main archives. The glow from the crystal. Shelves shifted in soft colors as he passed each row until he found the section marked for diplomatic health exchanges. The entries here were not sealed, and at first glance they looked harmless. Lists of meals shared at state banquets, exercise routines offered to visiting dignitaries, even schedules of rest periods during long conferences. But Daniel had learned long ago that the most dangerous information often hid in the smallest details. He slowed his pace, reading line after line, until a pattern began to take shape. In the weeks before the Queen's collapse, there had been an unusual number of extended, private audiences with the human envoy. The records did not list the topics discussed, but they did note the duration of each meeting and the vital readings taken after everyone. The readings were always slightly higher than her usual state, elevated pulse, sharper, neural activity changes in hormonal balance, subtle but consistent. Daniel remembered the alien medic saying her physiology made heart failure nearly impossible. Yet here was a slow build of stress markers recorded for weeks. He found another record buried deeper, one that made him stop and read twice. It was a transcript of a confidential exchange between the Royal Medical Staff and the Human Medical Liaison, discussing something called cross-emotional resonance. It was described as a rare condition in which sustained exposure to human emotional expression could cause an overload in species that were biologically evolved to suppress or regulate feelings differently than humans. For such species, the sudden surge of emotional energy, whether joy, grief, fear, or empathy, could strain their neural and cardiovascular systems. This was not something any alien physician would expect to see in the Queen, and yet the markers fit. Daniel felt the weight of the discovery settle over him like a heavy cloak. If the Queen's collapse was caused by human emotional resonance, it was not an attack, at least not in the traditional sense. It was the byproduct of close human contact. The very thing that had been strengthening diplomatic ties could also be harming her in a way no one had foreseen. Yet the secrecy surrounding it suggested there was more. The court feared not only for her health, but for the political fallout. If word spread that contact with humans could harm the ruler of one of the galaxy's largest empires, it could shatter trust. Alliances might crumble, and war might not be far behind. The thought barely formed before he heard a faint sound behind him, a footstep far too soft for a maintenance drone. Daniel's instincts flared, and he moved quickly between the rows, ducking into a shadowed corner. He caught a glimpse of movement between the shelves, a tall figure gliding silently, their face hidden by the folds of a long cloak. Whoever they were searching for something and moving with purpose toward the very row Daniel had just left. He waited until they reached the shelf, then slipped out from his hiding place and followed at a distance, careful to keep to the dark edges of the aisle. The figure stopped, scanned the shelf, and then removed a single data crystal, placing it inside a concealed pocket. Before turning away, Daniel's pulse quickened as he recognized the mark on the crystal. It was the same series tied to the Queen's medical readings. This was no coincidence. Whoever this was had come here for the same truth he had just uncovered. He kept pace at a safe distance as the figure moved deeper into the archives, then through a service door that led toward the medical wing. He knew following too close could give him away, so he hung back, counting the seconds before stepping through the same door. The corridor beyond was dim and lined with sealed panels. The cloaked figure was already halfway down, moving quickly. Daniel followed until they reached a secure lift guarded by an alien soldier. The guard seemed to know the cloaked figure and stepped aside without question. The lift doors closed, and Daniel was left staring at the metal paneling, with the knowledge that he had just watched the proof slip further from his grasp. But he also knew now that someone inside the Queen's circle was actively removing evidence, and that meant his investigation had just become far more dangerous. Returning to his quarters, he could not shake the image of the readings or the truth behind them. Humans were unique among the known species in their ability to project emotion in ways that could alter the behavior or even the biology of others. It was a gift that could inspire entire worlds, but now he saw it could also be a silent weapon. The Queen had been meeting with humans more than any ruler of her kind in history, and in doing so she had opened herself to an influence her body could not withstand. Whether it had been deliberate or an accident was still unclear, but Daniel was determined to find out. He sat in the dark listening to the faint hum of the palace around him and thinking of the object that had fallen from her robe. The two pieces of the puzzle seemed connected. The object could have been something to monitor her emotional state, or perhaps something meant to amplify it. If so, then her collapse had not been simply the result of human contact, but of someone deliberately pushing her to the edge. The question now was who would benefit from such an act, and why the next morning the palace was quiet in a way that felt unnatural to Daniel. It was not the calm of routine, but the stillness of something being carefully managed. Every corridor he walked held guards at key intersections, their eyes following him a little longer than before, as if they had been told to watch his movements closely. Daniel kept his pace even, and his face unreadable, but inside his thoughts were sharp and ready. He knew now that the truth was buried deep in the Queen's private medical wing, and that someone inside her circle was working to keep it there. The image of the cloaked figure in the archives still burned in his mind, along with the memory of the object taken from the floor the day she collapsed. If he wanted answers, he would have to take a risk, and that meant speaking to someone who might know more than they were allowed to say. The human envoy was the only one who fit that description. The envoy was stationed in the diplomatic wing, a section of the palace that stayed separate from the royal residences. Daniel had guarded that wing in the past and knew its layout. He waited until the change of shift in the guard rotation, then made his way through the wide corridors lined with banners of both human and alien worlds. The envoy was seated at a long table in a private meeting room, surrounded by stacks of data tablets. When Daniel entered, the envoy looked up with a guarded expression. He was not expecting a visit from a palace guard, especially not without formal request. Daniel closed the door behind him and remained standing, his voice steady, as he said they needed to speak about the Queen. The envoy's face shifted slightly, not with surprise, but with the kind of hesitation that comes from deciding whether to lie or tell a partial truth. Daniel explained what he had seen in the archives, the patterns in her medical readings, and the nature of emotional resonance. He watched the envoy carefully for any sign of denial, but the man only sighed and leaned back in his chair. Envoy admitted that what Daniel had found was real. The Queen species was not meant to process human emotional energy in such sustained amounts. They were built for control and suppression of feelings, not the flood of empathy and intensity that humans carried without thinking. In the early days of her meetings with humans, the effect had been subtle, her mind opening slightly, her expressions becoming warmer. But as time passed, the constant exposure began to strain her systems. It was not an illness in the way most species understood it, but a deep conflict between biology and experience. Her body was simply unable to regulate what her mind had accepted. Daniel asked why the truth was being hidden. The envoy's answer was simple, but heavy. If the alien council learned that human contact could harm their queen, they would see humans as a danger, not an ally. Decades of fragile diplomacy could be destroyed overnight, and the alliance could collapse into open hostility. There were those in the council who already saw humanity as unpredictable and dangerous. This knowledge would give them the excuse they needed to cut ties or worse, declare war. But Daniel knew there was still more to the story. He asked about the object taken from her robe on the day she collapsed. The envoy hesitated before speaking, and when he did, his voice was quieter. It was a small human device designed to help bridge emotional differences between species. It translated subtle emotional cues through micro vibrations, a kind of aid for deep empathy exchanges. It was meant to be safe, but in the wrong hands, its settings could be altered to amplify emotions rather than balance them. Someone had changed those settings and left the device on her person long enough for it to push her to the brink. The envoy did not know who had done it, but he suspected it was not an accident. Whoever did it had used a tool meant for unity as a weapon. The pieces fit together in Daniel's mind. The extended human meetings, the slow build of strain, the final collapse amplified by the altered device. This was not just a diplomatic accident, it was a carefully engineered incident. The goal might have been to break trust between humans and the Queen's people, to make the alliance seem dangerous and unworkable. Daniel asked if the envoy planned to reveal this to the council, but the answer came with a shake of the head. The truth would destroy more than it would save, the envoy said. Queen's life was already in danger from the physical toll and from the political forces circling like predators. The safest course was to let the official story stand that she had suffered a rare cosmic ailment and to quietly remove human contact. Until she recovered, Daniel could feel the weight of the choice pressing on him. If he kept silent, he would be complicit in a lie, but the Queen would live and the alliance might hold. If he spoke the truth, he could expose the sabotage, but the fallout could ignite something far worse. His loyalty as a guard told him to protect her, but his instincts as a human told him that truth mattered. The envoy watched him closely, as if measuring what choice he might make before Daniel could answer. The envoy warned him that others were already suspicious of his movements. The cloaked figure in the archives was part of the Royal Intelligence Network, and they had likely reported seeing him in the restricted section. If Daniel pushed too far, he could find himself removed from the palace entirely, or worse, he was told to return to his post and leave the matter to those above him. But Daniel had no intention of doing that. He left the diplomatic wing with his mind set. He would speak to the Queen herself if he could reach her. She deserved to know what had been done to her, even if no one else wanted her to. That night he studied the guard rotations around the medical wing until he found a narrow window when the outer patrols shifted at the Pathasde. Same time, a service passage used by medics and supply drones ran parallel to the wing's outer wall, and from there a hidden door led directly into a side chamber. The path was risky, but not impossible for someone who knew how to move without being seen. As Daniel prepared, he knew that crossing into that chamber could change everything. It might mean the end of his position, the end of his place in the palace, but it could also mean giving the Queen the choice that everyone else had taken. From her, the palace was quiet in the deep hours of the night, the kind of quiet that made every step sound louder than it should. Daniel moved through the dim corridors with steady control, his ears tuned for the faintest noise, and his eyes watching every shadow. The service passage felt narrower than he remembered, its metal walls pressing close, the air tinged with the faint smell of sterilizing chemicals. He moved with the patience of a man who had done this kind of thing before, counting his breaths, matching them to each step, until he reached the point where the wall curved inward toward the hidden door. Panel was flush with the wall, almost invisible except for a faint seam. Daniel pressed the release plate, and the door slid open without sound, revealing a short passage lit by soft blue strips at the floor. He slipped through and closed it behind him. The chamber beyond was smaller than he expected, a quiet resting room with soft light and the faint hum of medical machines. The Queen lay on a reclining couch, her crown set aside, her long robes replaced by a light garment. Her golden eyes were half closed, but when she saw him they opened fully, and there was no fear in them, only curiosity. Daniel stepped forward, stopping a respectful distance from her. His voice was low but steady as he told her he had come with knowledge she had the right to hear. He spoke of the readings, the pattern of strain in her body, the nature of cross-emotional resonance, and the way human contact had been changing her in ways her species could not easily endure. He told her about the device found in her robes, the one that had been altered to push her past her limits. He told her it had not been chance, but a deliberate act by someone who wished to see her harmed or the alliance broken. The Queen listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on him like she was weighing the truth of every word. He could see the rise and fall of her breath, the subtle tightening of her fingers on the edge of the couch. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, and then she spoke. Her voice was softer than he had ever heard it, but it carried the weight of command. She said she had felt the change within herself long before the collapse, the strange warmth and sharpness of thought that came whenever she spoke with humans. It had been both unsettling and intriguing, and she had not wished to lose it. She believed that this connection had shown her things she had never considered about the galaxy, about her own people, and even about herself. Daniel told her the envoy wished to hide the truth to protect the Alliance, and to protect her from political attack. The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, and she asked if he agreed with that. He hesitated, because he knew this was the moment that would decide everything. He told her that his duty was to protect her life, but also to protect her right to choose how she lived it, and that the truth belonged to her, not to those who thought they could decide for her. She rose slowly from the couch, moving with the grace of a leader even in recovery, and stepped closer to him. She said that the alliance with humans mattered to her, not only for politics, but for what it had taught her about the value of openness and emotion, qualities her people had long suppressed. She would not cast those lessons aside out of fear, but she also understood the danger. If the council learned the full truth, she decided the official story of a rare cosmic ailment would remain, but she would continue to meet with humans, though in controlled intervals that her body could handle. Daniel could see the resolve in her and knew she had made her choice. She thanked him for bringing her the truth and for risking himself to do so. Then she told him he would remain as her personal guard, not only because she trusted him, but because she wanted someone by her side who understood both the strengths and the risks of human nature. It was a position of great trust and great danger, but Daniel accepted without hesitation. In the days that followed, the court announced the Queen was recovering well from her mysterious ailment. The diplomatic summit resumed with less ceremony, but the alliance remained intact. The human envoy returned to his duties, the guarded exchanges between humans and the Queen now shaped by quiet rules that only a few understood. The guard rotations changed subtly to give Daniel more access to her chambers, a silent acknowledgement of the new role he played outside. The palace life in the Empire continued, the city lights stretching far into the horizon under the glow of the twin suns. To the people, the Queen was as strong as ever, her image broadcast across the worlds with words of unity and stability. But behind the scenes, she and Daniel shared a secret that could never be spoken beyond those walls, a secret of how close the galaxy had come to losing its balance, and how one human had stood in the shadows to keep that from happening. One evening, as Daniel walked the long outer balcony of the palace, the Queen joined him. She stood beside him, looking out at the sprawling city and the endless sky beyond. She said quietly that sometimes strength was not in holding back emotion, but in choosing when and how to let it in. He understood that she was speaking not only about herself, but about the fragile connection between their peoples. They stood in silence for a time, the cool night air carrying the distant hum of the city below. Daniel knew that somewhere in the depths of the palace, the altered device was locked away, and that the one who had planted it might still be out there waiting for another chance. But he also knew that the Queen was stronger now, not because her body had healed, but because she had faced the truth and claimed it as her own. And as long as she chose to keep the door open to humanity, he would stand at that threshold, ready to guard it. The galaxy moved on with its endless currents of politics and power, but within the quiet heart of the palace, an understanding had taken root, an understanding that would shape the future far more than any treaty could. The Queen had touched humanity, and humanity had touched her, and in that exchange, both had been changed forever. End.